In military history, some battles are famous because they are dramatic, and some are famous because they are decisive. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 was both. It has often been described as the largest tank battle in history, and while that label can simplify a much more complex campaign, it captures something real. Kursk was a massive collision of industrial power, operational planning, intelligence, and endurance. But to understand why Kursk mattered so much, we need to look beyond the image of tanks charging across open fields. The deeper story is about strategic initiative. Who had it, who lost it, and why it never truly returned. By the spring of 1943, Nazi Germany had suffered a catastrophe at Stalingrad. The surrender of the Sixth Army in February was not just a tactical defeat. It shattered the image of German inevitability on the Eastern Front. Yet, Germany was not defeated. Its army still held vast territory, and Hitler still believed that a major offensive could restore momentum. The German High Command now faced a central question: where and how could they strike to regain control of events? On the map, one feature stood out: the Kursk salient. After winter fighting, Soviet lines formed a large bulge around the city of Kursk, pushing westward into German-held territory. For German planners, this looked like an opportunity. If they attacked from north and south, they could pinch off the salient, trap major Soviet forces, and inflict a defeat large enough to stabilize the front and perhaps reset the strategic balance. This became Operation Citadel. At first glance, the concept looked familiar. Classic German operational design: encircle, destroy, and move on. But in 1943, the conditions were no longer those of 1941. The Red Army had learned from disaster. Soviet command structures were more resilient. Industrial evacuation east of the Urals had matured into production strength. And perhaps most importantly, Soviet intelligence had become far more effective. Long before German spearheads moved, the Soviet High Command already had a clear understanding of what was coming. This intelligence picture did not come from one source alone. It came from radio intercepts, reconnaissance, partisan reporting, diplomatic channels, and Allied intelligence sharing. The exact details available at each level can be debated, but the operational result is clear. Soviet planners knew the Germans were preparing to strike the Kursk salient, and they used time to build depth. Time was the key variable in this battle, and Germany gave the Soviets a lot of it. Hitler repeatedly delayed Operation Citadel. Partly this was about force buildup and logistics. Partly it was about waiting for new equipment, especially the Panther tank and additional heavy armor. To provide a technological edge, the delays made sense in a narrow technical logic. If the offensive must happen, better to launch it with stronger forces. But each delay had a hidden cost. Every day allowed Soviet engineers to deepen minefields, strengthen anti-tank zones, pre-register artillery, and prepare reserves for counteroffensives. By July 1943, when the offensive finally began, the Soviets had created layered defenses on a scale the Germans had not faced before. This was not a single trench line. It was multiple defensive belts, with obstacles, anti-tank ditches, strong points, and mobile reserves designed to absorb and then blunt armored thrusts. German formation still had excellent tactical skill, but skill alone cannot erase preparation measured in millions of mines and thousands of guns. On the northern shoulder, the German Ninth Army under Model attacked southward from the Ural region. On the southern shoulder, the 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf attacked northward toward Oboyan and Prokhorovka. The opening days showed the familiar pattern of German assault doctrine: concentrated artillery, assault engineers clearing obstacles, armor exploiting breaches. But this time, progress was slower, costlier, and shallower than planned. Minefields became a central factor. German units had to halt repeatedly for clearance, often under fire. Every pause exposed armored columns to anti-tank guns and artillery. Vehicles damaged by mines created bottlenecks. Recovery under combat conditions consumed time and men. The German offensive machine, designed for speed and operational shock, was being forced into a grinding battle of attrition. That was exactly what the Soviets wanted. The performance of new German vehicles also reflected the broader strain of the operation. The Panther tank, introduced under pressure, had formidable firepower and frontal armor on paper. In practice, early mechanical reliability problems were severe. Breakdowns and fires reduced available combat strength before many Panthers even reached decisive engagement zones. This did not mean the Panther was useless in principle. But in July 1943, technical maturity and field reliability were not where German planners needed them to be. The Tiger tank, by contrast, had already demonstrated strong battlefield impact in many sectors, but it was too few in number to transform an entire campaign. Heavy tanks could spearhead breakthroughs or dominate local engagements, yet Kursk demanded sustained offensive pressure across broad fronts. Even excellent heavy units could not substitute for strategic depth, secure logistics, and operational surprise. In the air, the Luftwaffe and Soviet air forces fought intensely over the battlefield. Germany still possessed experienced crews and tactical skill, but Soviet aviation had expanded and adapted. Air power at Kursk was significant, but it did not deliver the clear, decisive asymmetry Germany needed. The larger trend was visible. Soviet capacity to absorb losses and regenerate combat power was increasingly difficult for Germany to match. As the battle unfolded, German command also faced structural tension. The operation required synchronized pressure from both north and south, but battlefield friction disrupted timelines. When one axis slowed, the other lost strategic leverage. Operational plans drawn with arrows and timetables met terrain, mines, weather, enemy resistance, and logistics. The result was cumulative delay and increasing attrition. In the north, Model's forces struggled to penetrate deeply and paid heavily for limited gains. Soviet defenses held. In the south, German progress was greater. And this is where the fighting around Prokhorovka became symbolically central in post-war memory. Popular narratives often portray Prokhorovka as a gigantic, singular tank clash that instantly shattered German armor. The reality is more nuanced. The fighting was chaotic, brutal, and costly. Tactical outcomes varied by sector and by day, but strategically, what mattered was that German offensive momentum was being exhausted faster than Soviet defensive and reserve capacity. The Soviet command did not rely only on defense. While absorbing Citadel, they prepared major counteroffensives. Operation Kutuzov against the Orel salient in the north, and later Operation Rumyantsev in the south toward Belgorod and Kharkov. This is crucial. Kursk was not an isolated battle. It was part of a broader operational sequence. Germany committed to a costly offensive and then faced immediate, large-scale Soviet offensives on multiple fronts. The initiative shifted not in a single hour, but through this sequence of overextension and response. Another decisive external factor emerged on 10 July 1943, the Allied landings in Sicily. This forced strategic attention toward the Mediterranean and intensified pressure on German decision-making. Hitler began diverting focus and discussing transfers, including elite formations. Historians debate exactly how much Sicily caused the halt of Citadel versus how much the operation was already stalling. But in strategic terms, the point remains. Germany was fighting a multi-front war with shrinking flexibility. When major events erupted elsewhere, Eastern Front offensives lost political and operational priority. By mid-July, Operation Citadel was effectively terminated. Germany had failed to achieve its core operational objective: encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The Red Army, while suffering severe casualties, retained cohesion, reserves, and initiative potential. Then Soviet offensives expanded, forcing German withdrawals from positions that had seemed stable only weeks earlier. So why exactly did Germany lose the initiative at Kursk and never truly recover it? First, strategic timing favored the defender. Germany attacked after long delays, allowing the Soviets to transform the salient into a defensive fortress in depth. An offensive can survive imperfect intelligence, but it rarely survives when surprise is gone and defense is fully prepared. Second, the battle exposed a widening industrial imbalance. Germany still fielded advanced weapons, but Soviet production and replacement capacity were rising rapidly. Kursk consumed men and material at a rate Germany could not easily replenish, especially while also supporting other theaters and defending against Allied strategic bombing. Third, operational design no longer matched strategic reality. Encirclement offensives had been Germany's signature in earlier campaigns, but they depended on speed, surprise, and weaker enemy systems. At Kursk, the enemy system was no longer weak. The Red Army had evolved into a force capable of planned defense in depth and rapid transition to offense. Fourth, intelligence and deception dynamics had shifted. The Soviets were no longer strategically blind. German preparations were detected, interpreted, and countered. In modern war, an offensive planned in detail but observed in detail becomes far less dangerous. Fifth, logistics and engineering became decisive at scale. Minefields, anti-tank belts, route denial, and artillery integration turned movement into attrition. Germany's tactical excellence remained real, but tactical excellence cannot override sustained logistical disadvantage in a prolonged campaign. Sixth, command-level uncertainty and political interference remained corrosive. Hitler's direct involvement in operational decisions had long-term consequences. Delays, shifting priorities, and fixation on symbolic gains complicated coherent strategy. Professional military staffs could still produce capable plans, but execution under political volatility reduced strategic consistency. Seventh, multi-front pressure denied Germany strategic concentration. The Eastern Front required massive resources. The Mediterranean and Western threat demanded others. A state can sometimes win difficult wars through concentration at decisive points. By 1943, Germany increasingly lacked that option. Kursk also changed morale and perception on both sides, for Soviet forces and civilians. It reinforced the belief that Germany could be defeated not only defensively, but through planned offensive action after absorbing the blow. For German forces, it marked another point where hopes of restoring strategic control weakened. Even when German units later fought effectively in local operations, the larger trend was turning against them. It is important to avoid simplistic reversal narratives. Germany did not collapse immediately after Kursk. The war in the East continued for nearly 2 more years with enormous violence and fluctuating local outcomes. German forces could still inflict heavy losses. They could still conduct skillful defensive operations and occasional operational counterstrokes. But these were increasingly reactive. The ability to impose the strategic agenda, the essence of initiative, had passed to the Soviet side. From late 1943 onward, the Red Army launched successive offensives across broad sectors, forcing Germany into retreat, reallocation, and crisis management. The Wehrmacht's operational language changed from decisive breakthrough to damage limitation. In this sense, Kursk was a hinge, not because one day decided everything, but because the campaign confirmed that Germany could no longer reverse the war's fundamental direction through major offensive action in the East. Kursk also provides a broader lesson in military history. Technology alone does not decide campaigns. German armor at Kursk included some of the most feared vehicles of the war. Yet technology without logistical reliability, operational surprise, and strategic coherence becomes a blunt instrument. Conversely, Soviet success did not come from numbers alone. It came from integrating intelligence, engineering, operational depth, and reserve deployment into a system capable of surviving first contact and then seizing momentum. Another enduring lesson concerns adaptation. The Red Army of 1941 and the Red Army of 1943 were not the same institution. Hard experience, doctrinal evolution, command reform, and industrial mobilization changed its character. Kursk was one of the first battles where this transformation appeared in full operational form. The Germans were not fighting the same opponent they had encountered at the start of Barbarossa. Memory and myth around Kursk have also evolved. Soviet-era narratives often emphasized heroic mass attack and overwhelming blows. Western popular culture often simplified the battle into the biggest tank clash ever. Contemporary scholarship tends to stress system-level factors. Intelligence preparation, defensive depth, operational reserves, logistics, and campaign sequencing. This richer interpretation does not remove heroism. It explains why heroism produced strategic effect. When we examine casualty figures, equipment losses, and territorial outcomes, debates continue over exact numbers and comparative rates. But the strategic conclusion is robust across interpretations. Germany launched its last major strategic offensive in the east at Kursk, failed to achieve decisive operational objectives, and then faced sustained Soviet offensives that it could not permanently halt. That is the practical definition of losing initiative. Could Germany have chosen differently? Some historians argue that abandoning Citadel and adopting a strategic defense earlier might have preserved strength. Others argue that political and ideological constraints made such prudence unlikely. In theory, conserving mobile reserves for counterattacks against Soviet offensives might have reduced immediate losses. In practice, Hitler sought a dramatic victory to restore confidence and control. Kursk was the chosen instrument, and it failed. The battle also reveals the relationship between tactics and strategy. German units at Kursk often fought skillfully at the tactical level. Soviet units also showed tactical improvement and high resilience. But strategic outcomes emerge from systems over time. A tactically sharp force can still lose if it fights within a deteriorating strategic framework. Kursk is one of the clearest examples of that principle in 20th-century warfare. For modern audiences, the Battle of Kursk remains compelling because it combines scale with clarity. It is a story of preparation versus ambition, depth versus speed, and adaptation versus repetition. Germany attempted to repeat an operational formula that had worked under different conditions. The Soviet Union prepared specifically to break that formula. The result was not just a failed offensive, but a lasting shift in control. By the end of 1943, the map itself testified to this shift. Soviet offensives regained major territory, and German forces increasingly fought backward. The possibility of a negotiated or imposed German settlement in the east grew remote. Kursk did not end the war, but it accelerated the strategic trajectory toward Berlin. And this is why the phrase, "lost the initiative forever," is historically meaningful here. Initiative in war is not simply movement on a map. It is the power to choose the terms, timing, and direction of major operations. After Kursk, Germany still fought hard, sometimes brilliantly, but increasingly on terms set by others. The Red Army and the broader Allied coalition dictated the tempo more and more consistently. In conclusion, the Battle of Kursk was decisive not because of one dramatic tank charge, but because it revealed a structural truth. Germany, in 1943, no longer possessed the combination of surprise, material balance, operational flexibility, and strategic concentration required for offensive decision in the East. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had built a war system capable of absorbing, adapting, and counterattacking at scale. Kursk was the moment that truth became undeniable. Germany had gambled on one last major offensive to restore momentum. Instead, it spent precious strength in a battle the Soviets were prepared to fight. When the offensive stalled, Soviet counteroffensives began, and the strategic pendulum did not swing back. From that point forward, the Eastern Front was defined by German resistance rather than German initiative. That is the real legacy of Kursk, not only a massive battle of armor and firepower, but the irreversible transfer of strategic momentum in Europe's largest land war.